Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, in my previous video I've explained to you how we can apply the science of learning, laws of learning in terms of conditioning, whether it is classical or operant conditioning, and how we can turn the table around. That means from the negative use of conditioning to influence people to do evil things, propaganda and destruction, greed and so on, to how we can use conditioning to do positive things, which I've mentioned in the previous video. So this is very important, but the key basis to understanding that is basically we must have some idea what is classical conditioning, what is operant conditioning, and its related terminology. It's just a basis, but I'm going to show you the video later on. But in our book, chapter 4, we have some understanding or the description of classical conditioning as mentioned by Professor Mahdi Jenkins, John Jenkins. Alright, so I'll just read a part and then I'll show you the video, about 3 to 5 minutes. When you present a neutral stimuli, this is called the idea of classical conditioning, and he gave an example here. When you present a neutral stimulus shortly before some other stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, which already has the ability to bring about a certain response, and this previously neutral stimulus, when presented alone, take on the ability to elicit essentially the same response. Then in that situation, classical conditioning has taken place. Classical conditioning works also the same way for all animals and also human beings. The more highly developed the level of consciousness of the being, whether it is animal, that means from cockroach all the way up to rats and then to monkeys, apes, and the highest level of consciousness with free will is only human being. The more complex are the circumstances of conditioning process. So there are many inputs and many areas of classical conditioning process. At the human level, the holistic analysis is much more sophisticated and wide-ranging than any animal. Therefore, many more factors are included in the classical conditioning of human beings. So, for example, there are situations sometimes that occur with young children that it is very similar to the circumstances during salivation experiment with the dog. You remember the Ivan Pavlov experiment, when classical conditioning was first discovered. This involved the situation of a young child. For example, we take a young child who was first taken to a doctor, perhaps receiving a painful injection or treatment. The doctor might be wearing a white coat and be a friendly person whom the child likes at the first meeting. While the doctor is treating the child experiences pain, for example, the pain from the injection because of the treatment. The child responds to the painful stimuli, the injection, by crying and trying to get away from the doctor, which is common way in which many young children respond to things that cause them pain. This is a survival instinct. Now suppose a few months later, the child goes to another doctor, a different doctor. As soon as this doctor appears wearing a white coat, the child cries and tries to run away from the doctor. This time, the child is responding to the white coat in the same way the pain that has been responded to in the previous encounter with the doctor. The white coat was originally a neutral stimulus having no particular effect on the child. The pain was originally an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that naturally elicits crying and running away. When the white coat is paired with pain, the white coat took on the ability of the pain to bring about crying and running away. The white coat became a conditioned stimulus which would elicit crying and running away. Since the avoidance of harm is a survival tactic that is incorporated into the genetic makeup of human beings, our brain are structured to learn anything that can aid us to avoid pain. The earlier we recognize a situation that might cause us harm, the more effective can we avoid that harm. Okay, so this is some part of it. I'll show the video and then we'll have some short discussion if it's possible.
Pavlov rings a bell. It's because his experiments are among the most famous in the history of psychology. His work contributed to the foundation of the behaviorist school of thought that viewed psychology as empirically rigorous science focused on observable behaviors and not observable internal mental processes. Even though today we view psychology as the science of both behavior and mental processes, Pavlov's influence was tremendous. His research helped pave the path for more experimental rigor in behavioral research right up to the present day. Born in 1849 in Russia, Pavlov was never much for psychology. After giving up on his original aspirations to become a Russian Orthodox priest like his father, he instead earned a medical degree and spent nearly 20 years studying the digestive system, earning Russia's first Nobel Prize in his mid-50s for his research expanding our understanding of how stomachs worked. He didn't study human stomachs, though, because the procedures were terrible and cruel. He studied dog stomachs, and while researching those dogs, he noticed how the animals would salivate at a mere whiff of their dinner. At first, he found all that slobber annoying, but soon started to suspect that this behavior was actually a simple but important form of learning. For us scholars of psychology, we can define learning as the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Whether through association, observation, or just plain thinking, learning is what allows us to adapt to our environments and to survive. And as Pavlov began to discover, it wasn't only humans who learned. Soon enough, he was turning out his famous series of experiments in which he paired the presence of meat powder, yummy, which got the dogs to drooling, with lots of different neutral stimuli, things that wouldn't normally make you drool, like a certain sound or shining a light or a touch on the leg. Then Pavlov observed after several of these pairings, a dog would start to drool just at the sound or the light or the touch, even if there wasn't any slobber-inducing meat powder around. Animals, he found, can exhibit associative learning. That's when a subject links certain events, behaviors, or stimuli together in the process of conditioning. This may be the most elemental, basic form of learning a brain can do, but that doesn't mean that the processes behind conditioning are or ever were obvious, or for that matter, simple. In fact, the research that's gone into how we're conditioned by our environments has helped shape the science of psychology from a still kind of subjective thought exercise into the more rigorous discipline we know today. And it starred some of psychology's most notable and often controversial figures, including Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, and that guy who trained kids to be terrified of furry animals. Okay, I'm not a licensed dog trainer. Do they license dog trainers? But I can break down for you the sequence of steps in Pavlov's famous experiment to help you get a sense of how conditioning works. First, before conditioning, the dog just drools when it smells food. That smell is the unconditioned stimulus, and the slobbering, the unconditioned or natural response. The ringing sound, which at this point means nothing to the dog, is the neutral stimulus, and it produces no drooling. During conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, the food smell, is paired with the neutral stimulus, the bell sound, and results in drooling. This is repeated many times until the association between the two stimuli is made in a stage called acquisition. By the time you get to the after conditioning phase, that old neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus because it now elicits the conditioned response of drooling. Sounds super simple, right? If you have a dog, you've probably seen it tap dance at the sight of a leash, but in Pavlov's day, this whole series of steps hadn't really been studied in a lab setting or even thought about in scientific terms. Pavlov's work suggested that classical conditioning, as this kind of learning came to be known, could be an adaptive form of learning that helps an animal survive by changing its behavior to better suit its environment. In this case, a bell means food, and food means survival, so get ready. Not only that, but methodologically, classical conditioning shows how a process like learning can actually be studied through direct observation of behavior in real time without all those messy feelings and emotions. This is something Pavlov especially appreciated given his disdain for mentalistic concepts like consciousness and introspection championed by Freud. Behaviorist psychologists like Pavlov's younger American analogs B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson also embraced the notion that psychology was all about objective, observable behavior. In his 1930 book Behaviorism, he argued that given a dozen healthy infants, he could train any one of them to be a doctor, artist, lawyer, or even a thief, regardless of their talents, tendencies, or ancestry. Oh there, Watson! Thankfully, no one gave him any infants. In his most famous and, yes, controversial experiment, Watson conditioned a young child dubbed Little Albert to fear a white rat. Maybe that doesn't sound so bad rad, but he accomplished this by pairing the rat with a loud, scary noise over and over, and then demonstrated that the terror could branch out and be generalized to include other furry white objects like bunnies, dogs, or even fur coats. So yeah, that would not fly today, obviously, but Watson's research did make other psychologists wonder whether adults, too, were just holding tanks of conditioned emotions, and if so, whether new conditioning could be used to undo old conditioning. Like, if you're terrified of roller coasters, but you made yourself ride one 10 times a day for 2 weeks, would your fears fade? For the record, recent exploration has revealed that the boy known as Little Albert sadly died a few years after these experiments, while Watson eventually left academia and got into advertising, where he put all that associative learning to lucrative use. So that's classical conditioning, but we've also got another kind of associative learning, operant conditioning.
So we have some idea of, from the video, how we can use classical conditioning to overcome or to understand the nature of human learning, as well as how phobias are formed and how we can actually, now in the industries, they're using all kind of conditioning methods in advertising, public relation, promotion, and so on, which I've explained in my previous video. So it is important that we have this understanding of classical conditioning as a basis for us to understand later on operant conditioning, inshallah, in the next video. And hopefully we can then go on further into the details of how the loss of learning implies the application of the loss of learning and classical as well as operant conditioning and its related capabilities can then becomes the basis of how we can develop a new psychology based on Islam, that is, we develop holistic human behavior based on the foundation of the findings of psychology, whether it is classical conditioning or operant conditioning, and then applied at the many levels of human existence, not only at the physical, mental level, but at a higher understanding of human consciousness at the spiritual, emotional, and mental realms, inshallah.